was a cowboy. Well, so 70 years of the pandemic later, don't trust me with the gun. In Philippi, West Virginia, not to be considered or confused with Philippi, Alderson Brothers College, they have a small prayer room off of their chapel. It's pie-shaped. And they've cut off the front of the pie, squared it off, and there's a picture there. And I think Danny and Jill, you all heard this story. And it's a picture of Christ on the cross, laying on the cross as they're kneeling. And it's just about life size. It's about 4 by 6. And he's just laying there, looking out. And it's one of those pictures that there's no way that you can go in that, no place you can go in that room that he's not looking at you. And it's very moving, it's very unnerving, very thought-provoking. And I'm just going to ask that you'll keep that picture in your mind when I share this song with you. Like I say, just keep that picture in mind. Okay. Thorns on his head, a spear in his side, yet it was a heartache that made him cry. He gave his life so that you would understand. Is there any way you could say no to this man? If Christ himself were standing here, face full of glory, eyes full of tears, and he held out his arms and his nail-printed hands, is there any way you could say no to this man? How could you look into his tear-stained eyes, knowing that it's you he's thinking of? Did you tell him you're not ready now to give him your life? Did you say that you don't think you need his love? Jesus is here with his arms open.
Upon a time, there was a little girl named Goldilocks with a little breaking and entering problem. She went for a walk in the forest, and pretty soon she came upon a house. Being no respecter of private property, after she knocked and no one answered, you know what she did? She walked right in there. At the table in the kitchen, there were 3 bowls of porridge. Goldilocks was very hungry. She tasted the porridge from the first bowl. This porridge is too hot, she exclaimed. So she tasted the porridge from the second bowl. This porridge is too cold, she said. So she tasted the last bowl of porridge. Ah, this porridge is just right. And she gobbled it all up, much to the dismay of the bears that would come later on. But the reason I tell you this story is not to encourage breaking and entering. The reason I tell you this is it's, in a way, kind of a metaphor for my experience of trying to find the right church. And when there was a time in my life when I became spiritually hungry, you might say, and I was looking for some spiritual porridge, I tried some, let's just say, different places that were offering spiritual porridge. Some of what I tried just didn't fit with me. I visited with Mac McCutcheon this week at the nursing home, and Mac is in his 90s, and he was recounting some of his experiences early on in life before he found the First Christian Church. And he said some of his other church experiences were a little too rich, was the way he put it. So, when I found the Christian church, the first Christian church, it was just right for me. And what I'd like to do over the coming Sundays is to talk a little bit about, maybe celebrate, if you will, what are the things about the first Christian church that we find so meaningful in our life together. And what I'd like to talk about today is the practice of weekly communion. Let me just start here. How often does First Christian Church cancel worship services because of weather? Never. You know, this winter, if we get a huge storm and it shuts everything down and there will be a list of closings, what group will never be on that list of closings on Sunday morning? First Christian Church. Because one of the things that you learn is that no matter how bad the weather is, people will come through snow and rain and ice because they'll get here, and if nothing else, they'll get together and they will have communion. That is what they will do together. Now, there were a lot of things that I liked about the First Christian when I first started going when I was in college. But I'll have to say that, the first time I went to church, they had communion. And then the second time I went to church there, I noticed they had communion. And the third time I went to church there, I noticed, they had communion again. And after a while, I just came to not maybe take it for granted that they would have communion, but I just knew that was what we did. And I was in college at the time and stayed up late on a Saturday night. Oh, I had a lot to do, a lot of homework, a lot of assignments on Sunday. Oh, yes, I was quite a busy student. So there I was on Sunday morning. And I remember thinking to myself, well, I guess I have to go to church Sunday. And then it came. But if I don't go to church, I'll miss communion. And it in a way, you might say, communion kind of snuck up on me. I didn't know it was going to be that big a deal. But after I started going to church, I really liked the communion service. And at First Christian Church in Lubbock, Texas, had student. If you were a college student, they had something called student deacons, and you could actually help distribute the communion. And I volunteered to be in that college deacon group. And the Sunday mornings that I got to help with communion were just really, really special for me. There was just something about that weekly communion observance. You might say it got under my skin. I wasn't going to church to see the preacher. I was going to church to meet Jesus at his table. So that became important for me. And when I asked them at First Christian Church in Lubbock, why do you have communion every Sunday? They said, well, we do it. One of the main reasons we do it is because that was the way the first Christians did it. And I don't mean to say, our sign says First Christian. It doesn't mean that we're the first Christians. But the early church, that breaking bread together was central to what they did when they gathered on Sundays. I thought that what we would do is just take a look at that this morning. So, if you brought a Bible with you, if you would open that now, or if you didn't bring one, we have them underneath the chairs, and you should be able to find one. We're going to look in the book of Acts. And the book of Acts is in the New Testament. It's after the Gospels. So you'll find Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and then you will find the book of Acts. It's called, and it's not spelled A-X-E. It's A-C-T-S, and it stands for the actions, or short Acts, of the first church. And so it's just a story of how the church, you might say, got on its feet and got going. So we're in chapter 20 of the book of Acts, and it's quite a dynamic story. The last part of the book of Acts mostly tells the story of Paul and his missionary travels, and he just got into all kinds of interesting situations. He was in Ephesus right before this passage takes place, and all these people are starting to come to Jesus, and they're not they're not worshiping Artemis anymore. Artemis was the god, one of the main gods that the Ephesians worshiped. And so you might say, so what's the problem if people want to switch from if people want to switch from Artemis to Jesus? Well, what's the problem there? Well, the problem is there were silversmiths that made their money by selling silver shrines of Artemis, and if people switched to Jesus, then they wouldn't buy the silver shrine, so they were upset. Can you believe that people would get into religion just to make money? Amazing. But these folks got into it just so they were used to making this money off these shrines to Artemis. So Paul, there's a riot. He has to leave Ephesus, and then there's some other things that are happening, and Paul is moving all around, and he ends up going to this place called Troas. And there's just this little offhand remark that is made in verse 7. And it's so offhand that you could miss what a big deal it is. But one of the reasons that you know it's a big deal is because it's so offhand. So let me just read it to you. It says, "On the first day of the week, we came together to break bread. Paul spoke to the people, and because he intended to leave the next day, kept on talking until midnight." Now, if you just read that, you think, oh, on the first day of the week, we came together to break bread. Paul spoke, and he talked till midnight. That's basically what's happened. But notice the offhand way it's said. On the first day of the week, we gathered to break bread. Like, that's just what we did. I'm not trying to, there's no argument made about it. And let me explain to you why we did this. It's just, on the first day of the week, we gathered to break bread. Now, the first day of the week back then would have been what? Sunday. And so that was when their week started. Sunday was our Monday. Sunday was not part of the weekend back then. As a matter of fact, there wasn't a weekend back then. Actually, I saw a bumper sticker one time that said, "If you like the weekend, thank the labor movement." Because evidently they're the ones that lobbied for a 2-day break at the end of the week. So anyway, they did not have a 2-day weekend back then. Everything started up on the first day of the week. Now, one commentary I read said that their gathering on the first day of the week might not have started until later in the day. Why would that have been? What do people often have to do on the first day of the week? Work. Work. They had to work. So it may have been that they gathered later in the evening. So we might not have to imagine that church started at 8:30 in the morning and that Paul preached until midnight. Maybe it started later in the day, and Paul was traveling, and he said that he was in Ephesus for a week, and then it says, I think it says that earlier. Anyway, Paul stays to the last day of the week because that's when he stays to the first day of the week. He stays till Sunday so that he can be with them because that's the day that they gather together and that's the day they break bread. Okay, so why would Christians think Sunday was an important day to gather together? What would they be memorializing or remembering by gathering together on Sunday? The resurrection. They considered themselves to be a resurrection, defined by the resurrection of Jesus. And so that's what sort of began to, in one way, separate themselves from the Jews who were meeting the previous day, but they would meet on Sundays because they were a resurrection people. But in their remembering the resurrection, what would they do as a community in breaking bread? What were they remembering by that? The crucifixion. So what's happening is at the very essence, at the heart of the early Christian gatherings, they were gathering on Sunday and remembering what happened on Friday. See how this works? Gathering on Sunday, remembering what happened on Friday by taking this meal together. Now, according to church history, this was the universal practice of the early church. If you look at early Christian writings from the first 2 centuries of the church, there is everybody basically is meeting and breaking bread together. You can't separate early Christianity from meeting and breaking bread together. They wouldn't have understood, why would we meet on the first day of the week and not break bread? That's just what they did together. A guy named B.W. Johnson wrote, the early church fathers, from Barnabas, Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, to Clement of Alexandria, Origen, and Cyprian, all with one consent, declared that the church observed the first day of the week. Notice they worshiped on the first day of the week, and they are equally agreed that the Lord's Supper was observed weekly on the first day of the week. So there's just something that's very elemental about gathering on Sundays and breaking bread. Now, in saying all of this, I do not want you hear me being critical of other churches that do not break bread on a weekly basis. My point is not to be critical of other churches. As my friend Courtney Richards likes to put it, I'm not yelling, I'm just saying. I like it. It's filling, you might say. And I think you'll find that when you talk to people at First Christian Church, if you ask them, well, don't you get tired of communion every Sunday? They'll say, as a matter of fact, it becomes more and more meaningful to us. Now, I want you to tell you a story so I can tell you another story. Here's a story I want to tell you to tell another story. One time, Amy and I went camping in Texas, and it was it might have been a Labor Day weekend. I think it was a Labor Day weekend, so this actually goes very well with this week. So we were going to have a bunch of friends come, and we had reserved several campsites. It's a big state park in Texas, and so we got there. Amy and I were able to get there on Thursday night. We go there Thursday night, get our camp all set up. There's hardly anybody in the campground. It's just nice. There were some over here, some over there, just enough so you don't feel alone, but there's nobody really around you. So that was a very nice Thursday night. Then, Friday, a little afternoon, people would come straggling in, people camping here, camping there, and you'd see some nice families, nice groups of people that were coming to set up their campsite. And then, but nobody was pulling in right next to us. And so we thought, well, maybe it's going to be Labor Day weekend. Maybe nobody's going to be camping right next to us. 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, and then a little after 5 o'clock, here they came. The noisiest, rowdiest, most vulgar family you have ever seen. They drank a case of beer and had a cuss fight just unloading their pickup truck. Yeah. I mean, they were cussing and fighting so loud you almost couldn't hear it over the country music that they had playing as loud as they could play it in the pickup truck. Well, let's just say that maybe it didn't spoil our evening, but they were kind of hard to ignore. And it was just so it just kind of went on and on and on, and I will say that I became unappreciative of them. There are many times I wish that whoever was in charge would come and make them leave. But they just finally the massive amounts of beer sort of laid them down. And they quieted up a little bit. And then we had our little campfire. We were sitting around talking and visiting everything, having a good time with our friends. And then this guy from their campsite comes over to our campsite, and he kind of scares us because we're around the campfire. You know how your eyes get you're looking at the fire, and then just kind of out of the darkness, there was this guy. And he was beat up. I mean, this guy was an older guy, but he was like twice as old as he should have looked. I mean, just, one of those guys that just looked old. And he had just old and beat up. And he wanted to talk to me, so I started to talk to him, and we kind of went away from the group a little bit, and I was standing there talking to him, and he said that he just wanted to apologize for his family. And he turned out he really, it was really his daughter and her husband, the ones that were doing most all of the arguing. But he was going on about this, and I found myself just thinking, oh, man, I wish you would just stop. Okay. I wish you would just stop talking to me. And I just didn't want to stand there, and just listen to him go on and on about how messed up that whole family was. And then he said to me, so what do you do? Now, there are certain moments when you're a preacher, you're sorely tempted to leave that out of it. So I said, well, I'm a minister. When I said that, the man began violently sobbing, fell to his knees, grabbed my hand, and kissed it. This is not normal. I'm not used to that kind of thing. And I don't know if that was somehow part of his spiritual background. I didn't really know what to do with all of that. And that story came to mind in a flash to me as I was preparing this message this week because this is the other story I was going to tell you about. I was having a conversation with Amy last week about world religion. She's teaching Introduction to World Religions at Missouri State now, and so we've been talking about different world religions, and we're having a conversation about what is a mystical experience. What is a mystical experience? And I was trying to define this, and she gave me a good definition. A mystical experience is one in which you have a direct encounter with the divine. A mystical experience is where you have a direct encounter with the divine. And one of the things that it occurs to me is that when we have communion, what we are doing is making contact with the one who made contact with us. Jesus made contact with us, taking the worst that we could give him and then giving us the best that he had. Jesus made contact with our sin so that we could make contact with his grace. Now, what's happening then in the communion meal is not just a bunch of people going through a religious ritual. It's not people trying to fill up time in a worship service. It is the way in which we have a mystical contact with the nail-pierced hand of the one who loved us.